We are glad you've joined us to hear this message from Center of Hope Victory Church. We have a vision to release the spirit of revival and to raise up and equip Holy Spirit-led believers to do the work of the ministry. We hope you enjoy the following message.
All right, I want to talk today about warring from a place of righteousness or of a pure heart. And so I've got sort of two parts to this. The first part is more of it's a little bit more about the Constitution. Some of you, that's your worst nightmare, right? It's like, Constitution. That sounds so boring. But we'll try not to be too boring. So I've been thinking about Romans 13 lately. Actually, I was thinking about it, and I mentioned that to Pastor Tina, and she reminded me that she did an awesome message. I'm saying awesome. She didn't tell me I did an awesome message. That's me. So she did do a really good message. It was January 17th, called this year, 2021, Should the Church Be Involved in Politics? So this is kind of part two to that. And if you don't agree with part two, then just go back and listen to part one. All right, so I'm going to read just the first couple of verses of Romans 13, familiar to many of us, and just one that you hear in this season and maybe wrestle with. So, every person must submit to and support the authorities over him, for there can be no authority in the universe except by God's appointment, which means that every authority that exists has been instituted by God. So to resist authority is to resist the divine order of God, which results in severe consequences. So it says that we need to, other versions say we need to submit to and support the governing authorities. So I want to look at our governing authorities in Canada. Does anybody know what kind of government we have? Anybody? What is it? Do you know? Anybody know what kind of government we have? Yeah. Okay. It's not what I was looking for. So we have a constitutional monarchy. Does that sound familiar, anybody? Dig it out from your days of maybe nobody loved government in history and stuff, right? But we have a constitutional monarchy. So what does that mean? So I looked up some different things to kind of give us a picture of what kind of government we actually have. Constitutional monarchy. So the Constitution provides Canada with a legal structure for a stable democratic government. And I was looking at, I thought, well, I wonder, when our prime minister and our different people take an oath of office, what do they swear? And they actually swear an oath to the Queen. So I read a couple of things about what that means. So bear with me, we're going somewhere with this, all right? So what it means, because I just want you to get a sense of who is our governing authority in Canada. Who is that really? Are we a dictatorship? Is our governing authority a dictator, or is it something else, right? So the oath to the Queen is fundamental to the administration of the law in the country. It signifies that here in Canada, justice is done, not in the name of the Prime Minister or the Mayor or the police chief, as in totalitarian nations, but by the people in the name of the Queen. The oath is the way elected members of Parliament, who are assuming positions of public trust, promise to carry out their duties patriotically and in the best interests of the country. The federal court also expressed that giving allegiance to the sovereign was a solemn intention to adhere to the symbolic keystone of the Canadian Constitution, thus pledging an acceptance of the whole of our Constitution and national life. So here's my thought. And actually, I heard this somewhere else. I didn't come up with it, but it really struck me. I heard a teaching, and what it basically said was that if we are a constitutional monarchy, is our government that we are supposed to come under a person, or is it actually the Constitution? Because that is the governing authority that even our political people are supposed to adhere to, the Constitution. So you look at that and you think, okay, so actually are those that are going against the Constitution the ones that are going against God, right? Something to think about, because we're not a dictatorship. It's not a man, it's not a person, it's a constitution right now that is over our nation. And we're blessed in this country with rights and freedoms, right? And if our governing authority is our Constitution, should we do our best to keep those rights that we're blessed with? Because they're a privilege, right? It's a privilege to have freedom. It's a privilege to be able to vote. It's a privilege, and sometimes we lose that, right? When in generations, we've had it for a number of years, and we've maybe lost that sense of what a privilege we have in our nation and our freedoms, and what do we need to do, and what is our responsibility even as Christians to protect the freedoms that we have. And so I found, many of you know about the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. I just want to read a little bit from what they have to say. I heard John Carpe, who's the president of the JCCF, probably like just 3 or 4 months after the whole pandemic started. And right from the beginning, his whole heart was the Constitution of Canada. We need to protect the Constitution. He began to see freedoms being eroded, how it was hurting our nation. And, well, I'll read a little bit to explain his heart through all that. And I think there's a lot there. He's Christian. It's a Christian organization. It's a nonprofit. People donate, and they do what they do for free. So this document, it's a living document, but I printed it off, so this one's dead. But online, I think they update as they go along. So it's understanding your fundamental rights and freedoms in a world filled with fear. And the current violations of our charter rights and freedoms is unprecedented in Canadian history. So I'll just read you a couple of little sections from this. So under the charter, Canada's federal, provincial, and municipal governments may only infringe on our rights and freedoms to meet serious external threats and internal threats. But, so, lots of people say that there's internal threat right now, external, internal threat in our nation through sickness. It says the Charter requires that restrictions on our freedoms be imposed in the least restrictive manner possible, for the shortest amount of time possible. Further, any and all restrictions must be based on science and evidence, not merely speculation or conjecture, and not based on fear-mongering. If a restriction of freedom is challenged in court, the onus is on the government to justify that restriction is reasonable, and to explain why that particular measure was chosen over other less restrictive means that might achieve the same goals. And they go on, and there's all kinds of stuff in here as, who they are, what they believe, what to do if you feel certain freedoms have been violated. How does the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms work? The Charter is the supreme law of Canada, lays out the rights and freedoms of citizens to protect, I thought this was interesting, to protect citizens from government. It is a Bill of Rights that was added to the Constitution in 1982. And I think, I thought about that sentence, to protect citizens from government, and power does corrupt, right? So there's a protection there from power that can corrupt people. Our elected officials are servants, right? That's really what their calling is, to serve. So sometimes that gets turned around. Charter protections include freedom of thought, belief, opinion, freedom of the press, media, right to vote, right to a democratic government, mobility, rights to travel, enter and leave Canada, legal rights to a lawyer, language rights, rights to life, liberty, and security, freedom of religion and conscience, freedom of association, freedom of peaceful assembly, and the right to equal protection and benefit of the law without discrimination based on personal characteristics, including race, religion, and sex. So under what circumstances can government violate charter rights and freedoms? The law must cause minimal impairment to the charter right. It must infringe rights and freedoms as little as possible. And the law's violation, and this is really what I heard John Carpe talk about right, in month 3, 4, the law's violation of the charter right must be in proportion to the benefit it actually achieves. This means that courts can decide that the harm to Canadian charter rights and freedoms is too great to justify the law. So it goes on to say, why did they fight lockdowns? And their answer is lockdowns are inflicting a great deal of harm on Canadians, while politicians have not yet put forward clear and persuasive evidence that lockdowns are bringing about good. And it goes on to talk about, some of the harms that have been as far as, suicides, drugs, pornography. You guys know all the harms that have been going on in our society? And are those harms to society, is there more harm than good through some of the restrictive measures? And those are some of the things that we have to wrestle with. And we don't all have the same opinion on that, right? We may not all agree on that. What is an acceptable violation of our rights to protect us, and what is actually doing more harm than good, that we then need to say, I don't agree with this, and I need to stand up for my rights and freedoms. Churches and freedom to worship and gather. The last little bit I'm going to read from here is, what are our rights to gather and hold religious services? Faith communities have a constitutional right to be open, to hold services according to their faith, religion, beliefs, and customs, pursuant to Section 2 of the Charter. And then they go on to say they're working on, bringing to court, forcing governments to demonstrate in court that restrictions on churches are truly justified as necessary, rational, and reasonable. Governments must justify their violations of charter freedoms and ought to do so even when they're not being sued. So, as I said, so those are some of the things that our nation is wrestling with right now, right? That what is a violation of our rights? Is it justified by the harm to our nation? And so the second part I want to talk about, because we're not all going to have the same answers. We all have opinions. We all have thoughts. We all have ideas. We definitely, we want to wrestle with this because we don't want to lose our constitutional rights and freedoms. We don't want to see those eroded, because you can look at history. History shows us other nations where those freedoms were eroded, and it was not a pretty picture, right? We have to wrestle with things and look at these things and talk about them, right? Even if we don't agree, it's so good if we can talk about them openly and say, I think this, I don't believe you, this is what I think. I have seen these numbers, whatever it is, right? We need to talk about it and wrestle with it, but in a place where we're safe and know that we're still going to love one another, right? There are things that I say and do that God doesn't agree with, but he still loves me, right? So we want to love one another. One of the things, many of you know that I work for a nonprofit. I talk to people across the nation, and I always ask, how can I pray for you? And one of the biggest things that I'm hearing is, pray for my family. It's being torn apart. This one wants, believes we have to have the vaccine. This one doesn't. This one isn't allowing, grandparents to see their grandchildren. It's heartbreaking what's happening in our nation and how families and even churches are being torn apart by these different things. And we don't want to see that, right? So probably one of the best ways not to see it is to talk about it, talk about honestly, this is what I think, this is what I feel. There are people suffering in our congregation, people who are, I know that there's different opinions on all of this, but so I want to talk about that. And I want to talk about keeping our heart right, because that's so important. Because if we have any kind of anger, bitterness, all that stuff in our heart, you cannot fight the enemy with the enemy's tools, right? So if we go out, and it doesn't matter, it can look exactly the same, and we've talked about this. You can go out and say, I don't agree with this. If you do it in anger and bitterness, it's no good. You can also go out and say, I don't agree with this, but I'm doing it out of my conviction, out of place of peace, out of a pure heart, because my desire is to help others. My desire is for others. If I'm doing it out of that place, it looks maybe the same, but it's entirely different. And it's going to have, because we have to remember, our battle is not against flesh and blood. I think we always have to remember that. It's a spiritual battle. We have an enemy that hates us. It's not really people that hates us. It's an enemy that hates us. Hates us. We're made in the image of God, right? And we have an enemy that hates us. That's the reality. So we have to guard our hearts. And I think I probably talk about this a lot, but I think some of the stuff that's going on right now, it's so important. Especially when you hear about families, churches being torn apart. And you hear things, and some of them are hurtful in our democratic society, like things like, you hear people saying things like, I've heard this from a couple of sources, if you're not vaccinated, you shouldn't get health services. you could rise up in anger on that one, right? If you believe in a society where we don't do that, right? We don't say you're a smoker, so you can't get health services. That's a choice too, right? And whether or not you think the vaccine's going to hurt you, but you don't take away health services because of somebody's free choice. But those things can make you angry. In our local newspaper this past week, there was an editorial that said something about, basically she said that people are losing patience because the unvaccinated are taking up all the ICU wards, and people are losing patience with healthcare services that are being taken up by the unvaccinated. And she's taking away free choice, basically, in this article. But I was thinking, what is she really saying there? We're losing patience with the unvaccinated. So is she saying, what happens when they've totally lost patience? Like, where is that going, right? Where does that thought process go? If we've lost patience with people who don't agree with being vaccinated, does that mean you force them to? What is that? What are you saying? That you put them somewhere in quarantine and they can't touch the rest of the world? Like, you have to think through this logical thought process, that they're like seeds that go into people, right? And when I read that, I have to admit I was angry. So I have to make sure that anger and bitterness doesn't take root. And, I heard somebody recently say that they're very careful to make sure they spend more time in worship, prayer, and the Word than they do reading the news and social media, right? Because you can get sucked into a hole of just frustration and anger and all the stuff that's swirling around and the fear, and that's the other thing, right? The two things I think we really have to be guarding against are fear and what's the other one? Resentment and bitterness and offense. Offense, basically, is the other one. Fear and offense I think are just, and they can sneak in, right? Fear can masquerade as so many things. Fear can masquerade as wisdom. You can come across as being really wise, but underneath it all, there might be fear. We need God to really, and there's fear of man, which will undermine faith. So we have to make sure that we're walking in the fear of God and not in the fear of man in all of these things. And there's a lot to wrestle with, right? Like, what should church look like? What's happening in our nation? We just found out there's another pastor in New Brunswick that has been arrested. I don't know all the story around it. If you read the news, you get little bits and pieces that I would want to know the true story, because sometimes the news slants things. But New Brunswick, the law is right now that if you want to be able to sing with a mask on, then you have to ask people what their health status is. You don't have to ask people, but if you don't ask people what their health status is, you cannot sing at all, even with a mask on. No singing. So you come in, I guess you hear a word and you go home. So anyhow, I think this pastor didn't agree with that, and so now he is in jail. That's the whole details around it, I don't know. So more things to wrestle with, right? Like, what do we do as a church in the face of things like that? Things to think about. Jesus was a man of prayer and a man of action, and sometimes his actions offended people, right? We know that they did. We think about Mark chapter 3, verse 1. It talks about where he went into the synagogue, and he went in. There was the man with a paralyzed hand, and people were watching, and he knew they were watching to see, is he going to heal on the Sabbath? Because that's against the law, to heal somebody on the Sabbath, apparently. According to them, it's not really, but... So Jesus said to the man with the paralyzed hand, I love this part, stand here in the middle of the room. He's not going to go off in a corner and do it in secret. He says, stand here in the middle of the room, and he heals him. And he says, he said, before he healed them, he said, stand here in the middle of the room. And he turned to all those gathered there and said, is it against the law to do evil on the Sabbath or to do good? To destroy a life or to save one? And I feel like he's saying to them, look at this man. he's got a withered hand. Actually, I think another gospel says it was his right hand, which is the hand that most people they need. It's the hand of power, the hand that people use most often. And he's saying, look at him. I think he's like pleading with them, have some compassion, some understanding. And then it says that no one answered him a word. And it says he was moved with indignation and grieved by the hardness of their hearts, right? Like you're saying, let this man stay withered instead of me healing him because you believe on the Sabbath. It's wrong. So he did it anyway, and people were offended. And it said after that, the Pharisees left abruptly and began to plot together with the friends and supporters of Herod Antipas on how they would kill Jesus. So Jesus did not fear man. He wasn't afraid of offending people, but he never moved out of a heart of offense. And I think that is so key. His heart was always one of love, right? Even when he was chastising the Pharisees about you horrible people, I think he just wanted to break open that hard shell so that they would see reality, see life, see for him for who he was, Jesus who loved them and wanted to bring them life. So I believe that's how we need to make sure we walk, right? That we're not in anger, not in rejection. And because out of that, we really have to pray and ask God, what do you want me to do in this hour? What does church look like? We need to have a basic of what we believe, right? We believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he died, that he rose again, that he was born of the Virgin Mary. Those are our basic foundational beliefs, and we need to be solid on those. But then what does church look like, right? Does it look like this? Does it look like small meetings in houses? I'm just throwing it out there, right? What does church look like? What does God want us to look like in this hour? But I was thinking, I went to a prayer meeting at a different church somewhere, and there was somebody sitting, and then a space, and somebody else sitting. So then I left a space, and I sat down, and I said, is it okay if I sit here? And the person said to me, well, I don't think that's 6 feet. So then there was a chair and somebody else, so then it was really awkward. I didn't know what to do. The other person moved, I moved over. It was kind of awkward. And I thought about it. I thought, I had to work a little bit through anger and rejection, but I did. I know how to do that, so that's good. But what if you have somebody newer coming in who's having a bad day, right? They're depressed, maybe even suicidal, and we cannot come up to them and give them a hug, because I've been in that place where I've come in desperately and I'm thankful I have a husband at home. What if you're all alone? And you got nothing, and you go to a church and you can't go somewhere and know that someone's going to take time to listen to you, see your face, and hug you, right? Things that we need to wrestle with and think about in this hour. Other things, like things that I personally wrestle with, and I think it might look different for all of us depending on what God sort of puts on our heart, right? There's some of us that have a real heart for righteousness in the government. Some of us who have a heart for children. I think we all have a heart for children. We love our kids, right? That's one of the things I wrestle with. And I think we have to look at the big picture, not just little things. The big picture of what's happening to our children in this nation is abortion, the whole gender fluidity thing and not being allowed to impart identity into our children, where even that could become illegal, right? To be able to tell your child, you are a beautiful girl, you are a beautiful boy, like all of that stuff. So look at the big picture. And I have some concerns personally, but what do I do about that? About just the whole talk of mandating, I'll say it, vaccines for children, because they don't get sick. And it's from what I hear, even in I know that there's maybe some people in the healthcare industry that can tell me differently, but I don't grasp where there's adverse events that happen that are documented. There are people and it's, I guess, in any vaccination. But if children don't get sick very often, why are we even considering? And again, I look at the big picture because there's such an agenda against our children that it doesn't make sense to me that we would be even looking at vaccinating young children under 12 when their risk of getting sick is so minimal. And we know vaccination doesn't stop you from actually carrying the disease. Things that I wrestle with, okay? I'm just being honest with you. These are things that I wrestle with. And I think, God, what do I do in the midst of this? You know, and I have to go before him, as I said, because some things, and I think that we should be angry at some things that are happening. Like, there are documented things about how kids are being affected by wearing masks all day. That's affecting our kids negatively. It really is, right? There's health issues there even. So some of these things, I think they should make us angry, but we want to make sure it's righteous anger. And righteous anger, I think I've said this before, it's first going to drive you to intercession. And it's not going to be an us and them thing. It's not going to bring division. It's God. We have sinned. We have fallen short. God, have mercy and forgive us. And then what do you want me to do out of that, right? What is the action you want me to do? Because we do need to start in prayer, but there is action too that we're called to. Look at the life of Jesus. He was a man of prayer and a man of action, man of prayer, man of action. He went to the cross for us. So here, I'll just tell you some of the things that we are thinking about, looking at, we are going to do. I've been talking to Tina. We're going to set up a citizen action group, which we found out about through Southside Victory Church in Calgary, has had one for a while. And that's basically a group that kind of looks at what's happening in society, different bills, how we can have an impact on our culture around us. And so to be able to look at those things and then inform the body about them and how you can be involved and what you can do. We've set up an email just for that. If you don't like that stuff, you can opt out, but you'll be able to clearly recognize, okay, this is from the Citizen Action Group, as opposed to all the other stuff from Center of Hope. So that's one of the things that we're working on doing. And actually, next Sunday, John Carpe is speaking at the Southside Victory Church in person and by Zoom. I have registered to listen to the Zoom because I'd really like to hear what he has to say there. There's lots going on in Alberta too. And there's going to be things, right? Like, it's hard sometimes because we love one another, right? And we don't want to bring any offense because we know there's people in different thoughts and different positions. In our own home, and I said, is this okay to say, Ray? He said, yeah, sure. In our own home, one of us is double jabbed and one of us isn't. We love each other, you know? So I can say this and say, I think it's good just to tell you that so that you won't think I'm on one side of the fence and I hate this person or I don't hate, you know? That's the reality of our home right now. And there are reasons for that. If you want to hear more about it, we can tell you. But that is the reality in our home. So, yeah, I just want to make sure the heart is that we can talk about these things, that there is an offense. We have some people that are part of the Concordant Freedom Group. You know, some of us will agree with that and some of us won't. That's okay. It's exciting, actually. There's been some opportunities to, a couple of our people from our congregation have had opportunities to pray with people, to share the gospel. It's kind of exciting, really, some of the stuff that's coming out of that. So I guess my heart cry is, let's keep our hearts right. Let's love one another. Let's not reject each other because we have different opinions. We see that happening in the world, right? The division, the people coming against each other. You hear stories of, you know, people calling the police on other people and things like that. And we want to be a body that loves one another. I heard a really good story. It was leadership of another denomination, the Light the Fire Toronto Church. Anyhow, they were doing and their leadership has all different positions in that church too, as does Victory, all different positions. And they were having some kind of leadership conference. And this friend I was talking to, she debated whether to go or not. And then she found out that the place they were going to, those who were vaccinated could eat inside. If you weren't vaccinated, you had to eat outside, right? Because that was the conference center rules. So they decided everybody would eat outside. So there'd be no division, no us and them, no you. I thought that, what a great way. There are creative ways that we can still be a body, maybe not agree on everything, agree on the basics. Jesus died for my sins, right? but other areas where we're not going to agree, but we're still going to love one another, still support one another, pray for one another, be there for one another. Allow for open conversation and discussion, disagreement, but it's not going to affect our fellowship and our love for each other.
We hope you enjoyed this message. For more information about Center of Hope Victory Church, please visit centerofhopevictory.com.